Today we're talking about human population. And before we started the actual slides themselves, I wanted to draw your attention to this. This is the World Population Clock calculator. So this is on a website, census.gov, /pop clock. On this you can actually watch in real time the world's population going up and also the US population's coming up. It also has a lot of information about the number of births, number of deaths, international migrant, and the net gain of any one person every 23 seconds. This is a pretty sobering thing to actually look at and gives you an indication of how the world's population is changing. Okay, let's go. So, now if we go into the actual lecture properly, today we're talking about a topic. We've talked about some controversial topics in this class before. We've talked about climate change. We've talked about, some people find evolution a little bit controversial. But population and human population is possibly the most controversial topic we can talk about at all. It's one of those things where it's actually rarely talked about because it's so controversial. And at the end of this lecture, we'll talk about one of those reasons, some of those reasons why it's so controversial and why it's not talked about. But by the end of this class, you guys should be able to describe human population growth and recall how it's changed over time, dramatize the concept of carrying capacity, and illustrate how it affects diversity and abundance of natural ecosystems, and analyze graphs to examine the impacts of human overpopulation on the environment and diversity. So let's have a quick start with a fake clicker question. Just think about where you are on this scale generally. So this is my personal opinion on the current human population level. A, the human population can keep growing and everything will be fine. B, the population can grow a little, but we should start thinking about the consequences. C, I've never really thought about it. D, we should take steps to reduce population growth now. E, human population is a major issue. We need to take drastic steps now. Okay, so just take 5 seconds to really self-assess where you sit on this line. Okay, so first of all, let's look at human population growth through time. The first thing that we should think about is how we've grown. This image here, or this graph, shows human population growth through time. On the x-axis is time, the y-axis is our population size. It's a little bit out of date, but it gives you that basic idea. Now, humans first really evolved and appeared on the planet about, as we are now, Homo sapiens, about 500 million years ago to 1 million years ago. People are not exactly sure exactly when. We turned up somewhere in that ballpark. And for the vast majority of the time we've been on this planet, our population sat here, about 100 million people. We just ticked along quite happily for at least 500,000 years with about 500,000 people on the planet. Then something staggering started to happen. So about 8,000 years before Christ, so about 10,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution begins. At this point, we stop becoming entirely hunter-gatherers and we start actually growing our own food in the form of crops, and also we start domesticating animals. That means our population increases a little bit. Then we start metalworking. This is the start of the Bronze and the Iron Age. We start getting the hang of how we actually can manipulate metal and discover metal and get it to do what we want it to do. Then here we start to see ploughing and irrigation appearing. This allows us to farm more effectively and in more places. This gets our population increasing a bit more. Then we have the rise of the Roman Empire, the beginnings of civilization, and our population increases a bit more. Then the barbarians say, well, we've had enough of that, and that goes down and we enter the Dark Ages. Then we start to get the beginnings of sort of Western civilization. Then the bubonic plague comes along and says, no you don't, and knocks our population straight back down again. Lose about half of the population of the world in the bubonic plague. After the bubonic plague, we start to recover, and then we hit the Industrial Revolution. This is the point at which we start harnessing machines, we start harnessing engines and power, and suddenly our ability to produce things goes through the roof. This frees up a lot of parts of the society so that people can specialise in medicine, which increases our life expectancy, and as a result, our population goes through the roof. We enter this incredibly steep exponential growth phase. So what this means is, for the vast majority of our entire existence, up until about literally 150 years ago, human population just ticked along at an absolute maximum of literally 500 million people. We've now shot up, and we're currently sitting at around 7.7 billion in the space of 150 years. So we've suddenly gone through this very rapid expansion in terms of number of people. And this is true recently, especially here in Utah. Utah holds the record as, at the minute, the United States' fastest growing state. The population size in an awful lot of American states is actually flattened, so there's not really any growth at all, but not in Utah. We are rapidly increasing. We're basically working on a principle of every 30 years, we get a 65% increase in growth. Our population is almost doubling every 50 years here in Utah. That's what's been observed historically, and that's what's predicted to happen in the future. What's interesting about Utah is that most of this growth is actually what we call internal growth. It's not people emigrating into Utah from other states or other nations. It's Utahns having lots of babies, which is something that, there's a bit of a stereotype of Utahns doing that anyway. But that's why we are the fastest growing state. We're one of the fastest growing places in the entire Western world, bizarrely. Okay, so there's an awful lot more of us, but is that really a problem? Well, there is this rather unfortunate thing that we see where as we increase the human population within an area, as the human population has gone up, the number of species of threatened birds has also gone up. So we have this unfortunate relationship where as human population increases, we get an awful lot more threatened birds. Okay, that would start to suggest that we are associated with increasing the number of threatened species. The reason they focus on birds is because birds are charismatic, they're easy to track, they're easy to count. So we rather unfortunately see this relationship between more people, more threatened species. This, if we look at it historically, is actually far more dramatic. So the arrival of humans onto a continent is associated with what we call the extirpation of megafauna. And all across the globe, we've seen the extirpation of global megafauna. By megafauna, we mean animals that weigh more than 1,000 kilograms as humans arrive. So we can look at this continent by continent. Remember, humans first evolved in Africa. And Africa is the one place where we still do get quite a bit of megafauna. We still have hippos in Africa, still have elephants, some of the large antelopes such as eland, rhino. All of these large mammals can quite easily get above 1,000 kilos. But in continents where humans didn't evolve and have subsequently arrived, we see massive extirpation of global megafauna. So very soon after humans arrived in Latin America, sort of from Mexico and North America all the way down to South America, very quickly you see all the giant megafauna disappear. So that's things like the giant ground sloths. These things weighed several tons and were very, very common throughout all the forests of Central and South America. We see an extirpation of the giant armadillos. These things got to be bigger than cars, and they existed all through South America. In addition, we've seen the extirpation of giant rodents. There is the largest rodent on the planet is the capybara, which is actually this one here. It's not this big nowadays. Capybara gets about the size of a Labrador. But before humans arrived in Latin America, there were rodents that stood bigger than a Volkswagen Beetle. So when we arrived in Latin America, very quickly all the big animals were gone. Same thing happened in Europe. Very soon after humans arrived in Europe, we saw the extinction of all the giant megafauna. So we got rid of Europe's giant elk. This is actually an Irish elk. It was at one point the world's biggest deer. It was a lot bigger than a moose, both terms in height and in weight. It was an absolute giant, and it was common throughout large parts of Europe, especially Ireland, just down here. In addition, soon after humans arrived, we saw the mammoth disappear. The mammoth is actually a little bit smaller than a modern-day elephant, but a large animal, similar behaviour, similar idea. It was hairy, but these things totally disappeared off the map soon after human fossils arrive. Coincidentally, in some parts of Scandinavia, you can still go mammoth hunting, which is what these people are doing here. So you can go out and recreate the classic things that our sort of ancestors did, where we went out to the plains and we hunt a mammoth. I personally cannot see the sport at all in walking up with a bow and arrow and shooting something that stands twice as high as you are, but, you know, this lady seems pretty happy, so it must be some good fun. But again, all these big animals disappeared soon after we arrived. Australia was the most critical. In Australia, we lost all the megafauna, including Australia's giant wombats, the diprotodons, and also the gigantic kangaroos and the marsupial lions. All of these things are completely now gone from Australia. All of them weighed more than 1,000 kilos. In Australia, the removal of large animals was actually even greater than it is in many other places. In fact, at this point, the largest, heaviest animal native that's present on the landscape in Australia is the red kangaroo. That weighs at a maximum 100 kilograms, which is just a little bit more than me. So the biggest native animal left in land mammal in Australia is 100 kilos. However, one thing that seems to go against this idea that when humans arrive we immediately destroy biodiversity is this bizarre relationship where there seems to be an increase in species richness with increased human population. So on this graph here, on the x-axis, we've got human population density, and on the y-axis, we've got species richness. So we've got this situation where as human population density increases, species richness is also going up. So what's going on? Because we have this situation where, as we've shown, as the human population increases, we get an increase in the number of threatened birds. But as human population increases, we also get an increase in species richness. So what's going on? Why is there an increase in species richness and an increase in the proportion of endangered species with increased population? Well, is it A, people are nice and feed animals and plants, causing more to survive? B, people are generally good for the environment? C, people bring invasive species, so more people equals more invasives? Or D, it's impossible to tell? Just give you 10 seconds to answer. Okay, well the actual answer is C. People bring invasive species. So when we bring invasive species, we increase the species richness. And more people equal more invasives. So this has actually been seen in terms of its most striking in plants. So on this graph, on the x-axis, we have the per capita real estate GSP, so that's how much money we produce. On the y-axis, the number of exotic plant species per kilometre squared. What we tend to find is, as you increase the real estate, as people become richer, they bring more exotic plant species. More people, and as they get richer, they love things like ornamental gardens, they like to have pretty things around them. As a result, they bring in invasive species from all over the world, and that leads to an increase in species richness at first. So, we now know that species richness is affected by human populations, but what about whole ecosystems? Well, we can actually observe this all over the world. Because our big thing that happens when people start to arrive in an area is that natural areas become converted for human use. We touched on this a little bit in the previous lecture on agriculture, but now let's delve into it on a much broader scale. So when you look at humans' impacts, currently over 50% of the global land area is now modified for human use. And some of the most dramatic examples of this are the Asian island of Borneo, shown here, where in 1950, so only going back as far as 1950, pretty much the entirety of Borneo was forested. It was all covered in massive, pristine primary rainforest. However, as we go through time, that forest has been spectacularly decimated. So that now in 2020, it's less than 30% of what it was in 1950. So in the space of 70 years, we've lost more than 70% of the area of forest in the island of Borneo. It's even more dramatic if you look at the Atlantic forest habitat in Brazil. So Brazil is a very populous nation, has over 200 million people. A lot of those people live on the coastlines, especially this section just here where the climate is most amenable. Brazil's two biggest cities, Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, both sit on the coast here. And even going back as 1500s, all of this section of Brazil was what we call the Atlantic forest. This is different to the Amazon rainforest, but the Atlantic forest is a coastal forest system that's seen nowhere else in the world. This is what the light green is where it was in 1500s. In the 1990s, it was right down to here. And all of this has been converted for agricultural use. This is where a lot of our beef comes from. Any beef burger that you eat pretty much in McDonald's, that's come out of this conversion to ranch land of this forest here. So we tend to decimate entire ecosystems when we convert them for our own uses. And deforestation is a global phenomenon. What's most striking is that it's concentrated in areas of high population or high development. So on this global map here, the dark green is current forest, the light green is historic ancestral forest. And what we see is the areas of high population development, we've had massive amounts of deforestation. Some of the most striking, the entirety of the United Kingdom. There are tiny isolated dots left on the United Kingdom of wincy tiny bits of forest. And even those bits that are left are not pristine primary forest, they're all secondary growth. The same is true in northern France, and an awful lot of Western Europe has undergone massive deforestation. Again, some of the areas of high population density. Here we have China, the most populous nation in the world, undergone massive amounts of deforestation. India, the second most populous nation in the world, massive amounts of deforestation. The eastern USA and the Rust Belt states and going into the Midwest, massive amounts of deforestation. Mexico, highly populated areas, and Latin America, huge amounts of deforestation. And the populated parts of Brazil and West Africa. Even at a local scale, in countries that do not have high amounts of population, such as Australia, Australia had large forests going through its entire east coast. This is where everybody lives in Australia. Australia only has about 25 million people on the entire continent. However, they all live here, here, and here, and that's the area where we've undergone massive deforestation. So all across the planet, we see that anywhere where there's high amounts of numbers of people, or there's a high level of development, we see an awful lot of deforestation. And I think it's worth now bringing up the concept of a carrying capacity, because we are converting natural landscapes for ourselves to use. And so that gives us a question of like, well, how many people could we actually support? We've already converted more than 50% of the area of the planet for our own use. How many people could we actually support? Well, we can address this with the concept of a carrying capacity. And a carrying capacity is the population size that an ecosystem's resources can support indefinitely. That means not the population it can support now as you're destroying the resource to use it up, but the population that the ecosystem can support forever. So the resources are sustainable. Everything's keeping on going. And when we look at carrying capacities, we tend to see basically graphs that look a bit like this. So when the population first arrives in an ecosystem, its population rockets up. This line here is the carrying capacity. And what we often see is the population shoots up exponentially, it overshoots the carrying capacity, and so what happens here is the death rate increases, more individuals are born, more individuals die than are born, the population size starts to go down, it goes underneath the carrying capacity. At this point, okay, we've now got more resources than we need, so our population growth rate starts to go up, more people are born than die, it goes up, and we get these, this is called damped oscillations. as the population starts to get close to our carrying capacity. Alternatively, instead of these damped oscillations, we can get stable oscillations, where in this case, you have a population size starts here, shoots up, overshoots carrying capacity, individuals start dying faster than they're born, individuals are born faster than they die, and it just oscillates backwards and forwards. But the average level is the carrying capacity. So if you take the average of the trough and the peak and the trough and the peak, that number is the carrying capacity. Because generally what happens is when the population is below the carrying capacity, more individuals are born than die. Above the carrying capacity, more individuals die than are born. So what that means is when you're below the carrying capacity, the population increases towards the carrying capacity. When you're way above the carrying capacity, the population decreases back down towards carrying capacity. And this idea is something that's been shown in many, many populations all over the world and of many different species. So what happens in a system when a population massively overshoots an ecosystem's carrying capacity? So there can be situations in which when a population first arrives, they can rapidly exploit a resource, break it way down, and overshoot the carrying capacity. So what happens? Well, one of the most staggering examples of this is actually reindeer on Pribilof Islands in Alaska. So here is Alaska, and here are the Pribilof Islands. We're going to focus on St. Matthew's Island and St. Paul's Island. So these islands historically were totally free of large mammals, especially reindeer. And in 1910, 4 male and 22 female reindeer were introduced to this little tiny island of St. Paul's. This was because people that were maritime folks that were sort of sailing around here decided they wanted something nice to eat, and reindeer seem to survive pretty well in the climate, so they thought rather than having to go all the way back to Alaska or all the way back to Dutch Harbour each time we want any food, why don't we just put some reindeer on these islands and we can just pick them off as and when we want them. So they introduced 4 male and 22 female, so 26 deer. This population of deer increased to 2,000 individuals in 30 years. Okay, so basically 30 years, you've gone from 26 to 2,000. In 1944, 5 male and 24 female reindeer were introduced to St. Matthew's Island, just here, and they increased even more rapidly. So they increased to 6,000 individuals in 19 years. So we've got this situation, we've introduced a new species onto an island, we introduced a relatively small number, and their populations massively exploded. And how were they able to do this? Well, it was 2 ways. During the summer, the reindeer would just graze away quite happily on the brush that was growing on these islands. However, in Alaska, there's very little plant growth during the winter. So during the winter, they had to find an alternative food source. And the food source they found was lichen that grows on rocks. And the thing with lichen is it's very nutritious and it can keep you ticking along, but it grows incredibly slowly, especially in these subpolar landscapes. So when these populations were first injected, this shows them here when they're first introduced. The St. Paul's population went from 1910 screaming up to 2,000 individuals. The St. Matthew's population started here and shows this massive exponential growth and goes screaming up to 6,000 individuals. So both these populations show this classic exponential growth that you might recognise from the graph of human population that we showed at the beginning. So in 1963, let's focus on St. Matthew's population. In 1963, the density of reindeer on the island was 47 individuals per square mile. Critically, by this point, lichen had been completely eliminated as a significant component of the winter diet. The thing with lichen is it takes a very long time to grow. And remember, there weren't any reindeer on the island prior to 1944. What that means is the lichen had had thousands of years to build up and grow on the rocks. The problem was the reindeer, in the space of 20 years, destroyed thousands of years of growth of lichen. What that meant was, within 20 years, their winter diet had completely gone. So what happened? Well, both populations underwent a massive crash. On the St Paul's population, the crash took about 10 years and everything dropped down, but it ended up being about 15 to 20 individuals, just like it was to start with. On the St Matthew's Island, the population crash was far more dramatic. In the space of a couple of years, the population went from 6,000 individuals down to 42 individuals. They'd completely overshot their carrying capacity, and the number of them plummeted. Bearing in mind, this entire landscape, this entire island, is less than 100, is about 100 square miles in total, just over. Can you imagine being on an island where 5,950 reindeer have just died? The whole place must have absolutely stank, and it was littered with the corpses of starved reindeer. This gives you an indication of a species that had arrived on a new island, exploited a resource, massively overexploited it. When it ran out, it died spectacularly. Because they were able to overshoot the carrying capacity of the island, because the resource they were using as a winter food, as a lichen, had taken thousands of years to grow. In the space of a few short years, they'd eaten thousands of years of resource. And so as a result, there was no way it was sustainable. So this brings us on to people globally. So we've got this idea of a carrying capacity. We know what happens if we overshoot the carrying capacity. So what is the Earth's carrying capacity for people? Well, carrying capacity is made up of two pieces of information. One, the amount of resources an individual uses. So if you have individuals that are using more resources, the carrying capacity goes down. If you have individuals using very few resources, the carrying capacity goes up. Secondly, the number of individuals. And a combination of the number of individuals and the amount of resources an individual uses tells you your carrying capacity. Well, in the 1990s, the population biologist Joel Cohen calculated that if everybody used the same resources as the average Italian, and the reason he picked an Italian is because an Italian has relatively intermediate resource use. They don't use nearly as many resources as an Australian or an American, but they do use an awful lot more than a Middle Easterner or an African. And Italians generally have a pretty high quality of life. They have a very good social structure. Their economy's been pretty much flat for the last 20 years. They're generally pretty happy, and they have intermediate resource use. So Joel Cohen said, well, if we take the average Italian as a benchmark, the entire world, that's if we used every single resource on the planet just to look after us, there's no natural ecosystems left. But if we were all Italians, the entire world would have enough resources to sustainably support 1 billion people. We, as humans, are currently at 7.7 times that value of the calculated carrying capacity. Because the reason we've been able to get so high is that modern forms of modern production has essentially allowed us as people to borrow from the future. Because what we're doing is increasing production today, now, degrades resources. This is something we talked about in the agricultural lecture. This degradation of resources reduces future production potential. So what we do is we overexploit today, reducing the quality of the resource, but that reduces our ability to produce things in the future. This annual reducing future production potential is measured by what we call the Earth Overshoot Day. And the Earth Overshoot Day is when people use the equivalent of all the resources the planet produces annually. The first time we ever hit an Earth Overshoot Day happened in the 1970s. In 2019, last year, Earth Overshoot Day was 29th of August. This is 7 days earlier than 2015 when I first started teaching this class. What this means is that we, as a human population, had used all the resources the Earth can produce in an entire year. We'd used them all by the 29th of August. Every single resource we used from 30th of August onwards was borrowing from the future. So this brings us up to the next question. Well, if we are borrowing from the future and we've massively overshot carrying capacity, well, what happens to people who continuously overshoot their carrying capacity? Well, we can actually get a history lesson. So this is a place called Easter Island. It is a Pacific island, and it is the most remote colonized island on the planet. Easter Island is a volcanic island that sits in the middle of the Pacific, literally about 2,000 or 3,000 miles away from the next nearest landmass, which would be South America. It's a volcanic island made up of 3 main volcanoes, which sit here in the centre of the island, here at one extreme and here down at the other. The island itself is not very big. Here's the scale bar. This is 3 miles. So it's got to be, what, 15 miles end to end and 15 miles in this direction. It is a tiny little island. How on earth people got there in the first place is anyone's guess. This was colonized by Pacific Islanders, folks that we now associate with Polynesia and places like that, or Hawaii. These guys were able, on small canoes, to find literally a dot in the middle of the Pacific. But it was colonized, first colonized about 1,500 years ago. Oh, sorry, colonized about 1,000 years ago. I'm thinking of Hawaii. I do apologise. So Easter Island was first colonized about 1,000 years ago. When people first arrived onto the island, it was covered in a large endemic palm tree. The whole surface of the island was covered in a palm tree that was the largest palm tree the world has ever seen. Now these people that arrived, these Polynesians, they were used to making canoes. And the palm trees on the island were brilliant because they were the largest palm trees in the world. So they used these trees to build canoes, and that allowed the islanders to move around, and it also allowed them to harvest fish from the ocean and collect a great source of food. Also, the islanders found that after when the land was cleared of trees, it's initially very fertile. So when you first clear the land and take the trees away, the topsoil that's built up over thousands and thousands of years on the island was very fertile, and they had a very strong agricultural culture. So these people were living very well for a long time. They had access to the ocean and these giant canoes they could use to go and catch fish. They also had land that initially was very fertile, so very strong agriculture. And archaeological evidence of the island indicates that a peak population on this island hit about 4,000 people. So this small little tiny island, because it was so fertile and the oceans around it were so fertile, it was able to support 4,000 people. It had a strong cultural hierarchy. There were chieftains, there were bureaucrats. It was a strong social network. And Easter Island, as a consequence of its fertility, actually had a very well-developed culture. Some of it you might recognise. So Easter Island is where we get these large head statues from. These large head statues are made out of stone. These statues become culturally very important. So everybody has to have one of these in their front yard. There are multiple statues in the houses of chieftains and things like that. So these statues become what people live for. Now these statues were moved by cutting logs to make tracks and also using ropes to walk them around. And the desire for these head statues was so strong, it actually led to immense amounts of deforestation, as people, even if they didn't need the land for agriculture, were so desperate to move these statues around and put them in front of their houses, they would cut down trees in order to make tracks and move them. And eventually, all the palm trees on the island were cut down. All of them. The endemic Easter Island palm is now extinct. When it went extinct, the largest palm tree on the planet went extinct with it. It is completely gone. Any palm tree that you see on Easter Island, and there were some that I showed up earlier, those have been planted after the fact in an attempt to help. What's crazy about this whole system is, look how small Easter Island is. As we said before, that's 3 miles. It's a tiny little island. Any person that was living on this island would have known the geography and the layout of the whole place. What this means is the person that cut down the last palm tree knew exactly what they were doing. The person who cut down the last palm tree knew they were cutting down the last palm tree, and they did it anyway. And what was critical was, without the trees' root systems, that topsoil that was so fertile all started to wash into the ocean. Without the trees' roots to hold it in place, and with the high levels of rains that had made the place so fertile to begin with, every time it rained, large amounts of topsoil would just wash straight into the sea. As a result, the population of Easter Island began to starve. Because no topsoil means no agriculture. You can't grow crops on the island anymore. In addition, no more palms means no more canoes. And no more canoes means no fishing, so you can't harvest from the ocean. And critically, it means no means of escape. Suddenly, the Easter Islanders found themselves marooned on their tiny island paradise in the middle of the Pacific. They'd cut down all the palms, and they were stuck. They had no means of escape, and they'd exhausted all of their natural resources. As a result, the population fell from 4,000 at its max down to 635 individuals in 1775 when Europeans first arrived on the island. Those European sailors were the first people to arrive on Easter Island in about 1,000 years. The people that had been marooned on there, that population had been marooned on the island, on literally a dying island, for the last 500 to 600 years. Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, actually describes Easter Island as the clearest example of a society that destroyed itself by over-exploiting its own resources. Easter Island has been described as a parable for the world in general. The islanders had no means of escape from where they were, and they'd over-exploited their resources to the point they destroyed the ecosystems on which they survived. Because that's quite a depressing story, here's a happy little picture of a newborn baby gorilla having its heartbeat measured with an overly cold stethoscope, resulting in a silly facial expression, and a little baby cute meerkat, because it's probably the cutest thing on the planet. In addition, because we're extra depressed, here's a picture of an owl being sprayed by a hosepipe, just because it makes me chuckle. So given that we now know that over-exploiting resources within a high population is difficult, should we try and limit population growth? Has it been tried? Well, we're going to talk now about why is limiting population growth so difficult, and we're going to focus on examples of when we have actually tried in history. Now, one of the biggest ones was China's one-child policy. For those that don't know, China's one-child policy existed from 1979 to 2015, and what it basically said was that each family could only have one single child. The issue with this was, first and foremost, it led to a very male-biased population. In China, sons are revered far more than daughters. And unfortunately, if families found out they were having a daughter, in many cases they would either abort the child when it was still in the womb, so they could try again and try and have a male, or the child would be killed after it was born, often by just being abandoned. Through many years of this happening, it's led to a very male-biased population in China. And you can think about the other knock-on incidents this has had. So, for example, getting married in China is actually quite a challenge if you're a guy. In addition, the population of China has age structural problems. There are now families in which one single child is trying to support their parents and also their own family. The reason for this is because unlike many other nations in which you have the population in lower generations continuously getting bigger, in China the lower generations are actually smaller than the generations that precede it, which has led to a very elderly-based population. Because of the issues that it came, China now has a two-child policy. So you're allowed one more child in China. So rather than a one-child, you can have a two-child policy. And it's hoped this is going to get over some of the issues with the male-biased population and the structural problems. So this has been tried. It's incredibly controversial. Can you imagine if they tried to do something like this here in Utah, what the outcry would be? However, we do have to admit, even if it's controversial, it has slowed population growth. So even if it's difficult, it did actually work in China. I don't think it would ever fly over here, but in China it definitely worked. My mouse is playing up. Another example of when it's been tried is the concept of eugenics. Now, I don't know if anyone has ever heard the word eugenics before, but it's potentially even more controversial than China's single policy. Because the whole principle of eugenics, as shown by these posters here, is that it's based on the idea of licenses to have children. And so we've had these propaganda posters of things like, only healthy seed must be sown, check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. And people could even be issued with these eugenic certificate. This guarantees that I have examined the sender of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. The idea behind eugenics was that people have a physical, financial and mental assessment, and based on that mental assessment we decide A, if they're allowed to have children, and B, how many children they should have. Guess who was the big proponents of eugenics? So the Nazis absolutely loved the concept of eugenics. It was the basis of an awful lot of Nazi society and the idea of the superiority of the Aryan race. Even within Nazi society, they would carry out physical assessments on people and decide whether or not you were capable of having children at the family level. In addition to their family measurements, they also had something called the Lebensborn program. The Lebensborn program was the most hardcore eugenics ever undertaken. And the idea behind the Lebensborn program was SS officers, so members of the Secret Service, were encouraged to sire children with what they deemed racially appropriate single women. Essentially, the SS would identify racially appropriate women from broader society, usually unmarried, usually young, 16, 17, 18, and these women would be bred with SS officers. The children these women produced were then not raised by their mothers. These children were then moved into a secondary part of the Lebensborn program, and they were raised by SS officers in own schoolings. The Lebensborn children, some of them are still alive today. One of them, who is the most famous, is Frida Lindskog from ABBA. Frida was actually born as part of the Lebensborn program. Her mother was Swedish, her father was an SS officer, and her mother was moved into Nazi Germany, bred with a SS officer. However, she was then subsequently smuggled out of the program later and was raised in Sweden. Anyone who's seen Mamma Mia, that's where ABBA comes from. That's where ABBA produced many of the songs that were in the Mamma Mia movies, and it's just worth thinking about who these people are when we're talking about these sort of programs. Eugenics, as a consequence, was highly controversial. The goal of it, overall of eugenics in Nazi Germany, was to eliminate life unworthy of life. As part of the eugenics program, over 400,000 forced sterilizations were carried out. These were people who had been measured and then deemed unworthy of life. They were prevented from ever breeding through forced sterilization. However, the Nazis went even further and even euthanized about 300,000 people who not only did they deem were unworthy of breeding, but were unworthy of being alive at all. This is in addition to all of what went on at Auschwitz and stuff like that. So eugenics was crazy controversial. We might think, oh well, nothing like that would ever fly over in the US. However, many of the ideas from the Nazi eugenics program originated in the USA. The USA was where eugenics started. All these ideas that the Nazis carried out started here in the US. So the USA had extensive eugenics programs from 1909, before the Second World War, right up into the 1970s. Hardcore eugenics programs still exist in this nation the year I was born. The eugenics programs in the US focused on forced sterilization and birth limitation of what were deemed the infirm and the feeble-minded, and critically, they were skewed towards minorities. In total, 32 states in the US have had eugenics programs of some sort, either in the form of forced sterilization and birth limitation or removing people from society. Some of these eugenics programs were pretty stern. For example, North Carolina, if you had an IQ test and your IQ test came back as less than 70, this was grounds for you to be forcibly sterilized. Now, what's really interesting is, where did this take place in the US? Was it all across the nation? Nope. It was good old liberal hippie California. California was the eugenics capital of the world in the 1930s. California had identified that its population was growing. This was soon after the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, and they ramped up eugenics really, really hard. Now, the ideas and the eugenics program that started off in California actually directly influenced the Nazi ideas on human breeding. All of what the Nazis were trying to enforce originated in California. And some of the history of this is pretty staggering. So Charles Goethe, who was a big part of the eugenics program in California, he actually visited Nazi Germany while Hitler was in power, but before the Second World War, to help them develop their eugenics program. And he reported back to a colleague with this statement: "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." Remember, this is a statement from one Californian to another, after that Californian had visited Nazi Germany to help them develop their program to guide breeding in Hitler's Germany. And this happened really close to home. Utah actually had a eugenics program up until 1963. That's when we finally got rid of ours. And there was focused on forced sterilizations. They would identify people in the community they did not believe were worthy of breeding, and they would force sterilize them. If you look at the number of individuals, this program started in 1928. By 1963, we had forced sterilized nearly 800 people in this state. So this is not some arcane thing from history hundreds of years ago, and it's not something that took place an awful long way away. It was here in Utah within the lifetime, probably, of your parents. So, now we've talked about it, let's have a quick thought about eugenics and me. How do I feel about eugenics? A, I'm against it. B, I have no opinion either way. C, I am supportive of some aspects of it. D, this is something we should try and implement now. Just have a real think about some of these ideas and where they sit with you. Okay, so why is limiting population so difficult? We've talked about eugenics, talked about a single child policy, but there is one thing that reduces population growth by reducing birth rates, and that is the education and empowerment of women. Here in the West, and pretty much all over the West, birth rates have actually dropped below replacement. And it's due to things like this, the contraceptive pill. And what it's led to is that here is a graph. On the x-axis we have time, as we always do. On the y-axis we have fertility rate. So this is the number of children born in a society per woman. The replacement rate is about 2.1. So every woman has to produce 2.1 children in order for the population to sustain itself. And if we have a look, here we've got the United States, France, United Kingdom, Canada, Italy and Germany. All of these nations, their population growth rate has dropped below replacement. Most notably in Italy and Germany. The US, we're nearly at replacement, but we have dipped below it. So even though limiting population growth rate through eugenics and through single child policies is incredibly controversial, we've actually achieved the same thing in terms of reducing our population just through education. Okay, so that's the end of the class. I shall speak to you soon, and have a good one.